Welcome to our fourth session, Introduction to Hasidism. Our first session was focusing on the Baal Shem Tov. Then we talked about Hasidic tales. Then in our third session, we had a brief introduction to Hasidic nigun, Hasidic melody, as well as the very broad and significant theme of the role of women in Hasidism. So this is our fourth and final session for this series. And we're going to bring Hasidism into the modern period. That is to say, earlier lectures largely focused on the beginning periods of Hasidism, the 18th and maybe even into the 19th century. Now we're going into the 20th and 21st century. The 20th century was a very difficult one for the Hasidic movement, really for the Jewish people as a whole in different ways, as we will see. And in particular, we have, all of us know, the great catastrophe, the catastrophic event that is known as the Khurban or the Shoah, the Holocaust. The renaissance of Hasidism after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, is largely due to the dynastic principle. In cases where the Rebbe survived and resettled in Israel or the US or elsewhere, the Hasidic group reconstituted itself. The examples of Lubavitch, of Satmar, of Ger, of Bobov, of Vishnitz, of Belz, and Karlin Stolin, and others, with large, thriving, growing communities, come readily to mind. Other noble dynasties whose royal families suffered near total annihilation at the hands of the Nazis have not yet returned to anything like their pre-war strength. The extraordinary post-war revival of Hasidism is astonishing, far exceeding what most people could have foreseen in the decimated Hasidic communities of 1945 in the aftermath of the Khurban. Yet this very success now leads to challenges and tensions. Many dynasties have grown to such an extent that they may be too large to be led by one individual, especially with the personal touch and intimacy that was once the hallmark of Hasidic leadership. The problem generally emerges with particular force after the death of a leader, with rifts in the community sometimes rising to the level of violent intensity. The Satmar Hasidim have undergone a bruising and embarrassing succession struggle that was taken to the secular courts. On the other hand, the passing of the Bostoner Rebbe, Rav Levi Yitzchak Horowitz, in 2009, and that's the city where I come from, the city of the Bostoner Rebbe, was followed by an apparently amicable arrangement where his three sons each inherited one location of influence and associated institutions: Har Nof in Jerusalem, Boston, and Borough Park, Brooklyn. The greatest succession drama of the contemporary period may be the Lubavitch lineage, where the seventh Rebbe left no successor. Yet the mission of his emissaries continues with unabated vigor throughout the world. The widespread predictions of disillusionment and collapse after the death of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson in 1994 failed to be realized, and the Chabad movement is stronger and bigger and more influential than ever. Like the Breslov Hasidim, Chabad Lubavitch may be on the path to discovering that no succession plan is needed when the fervor and devotion of followers keep the Master's presence as an active, dynamic force guiding their lives. In the end, this is what Hasidim have always known. As much as the Rebbe makes the Hasidim make the Rebbe. And in that spirit, I'd like to share a story. You know, this is our final session of this cycle. And I'm going to lift up as much as I can some of the earlier teachings, the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, B'chol Dorachecha Da'eu, focusing on the verse in Mishlei and Proverbs, know God in all your ways, which means knowing God through story, through dance, through music, especially through nature. So here's a story that I heard about succession in the 20th century. I'm not going to say the name of the Hasidic group for reasons that will become obvious. There was a great Hasidic Rebbe who emigrated at some point to the United States, actually in the 1930s. And he had no sons. He did have a daughter. The daughter married a fine Talmid Chacham. He was a Litvische Talmid Chacham. He was a Ben Yeshiva, is to say he had really no knowledge of or contact with Hasidism. So that couple had a son. This was now the grandson of the original Rebbe. He went to a traditional Litvish yeshiva. I believe it was Lakewood. And he learned for many years, growing up to be not only a respectable, but a serious, a prominent Talmid Chacham, very respectable scholar in Talmud and Poskim, a Yoreh Shamayim, a God-fearing person in every way. But other than the fact that he knew that he had an illustrious grandfather who had a Hasidic Rebbe, who was a Hasidic Rebbe, he didn't have much contact with or knowledge of Hasidism. At some point, the Hasidic community of his grandfather had reestablished itself in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. And they were functioning without a Rebbe, with the memories of the grandfather, but they wanted to have a Rebbe. They knew now that there was a grandson of the previous Rebbe, who again was a fine Yoreh Shamayim, a God-fearing person in every way, really a tremendous Talmid Chacham, but it did not have much contact with Hasidism. They wanted him to take his grandfather's position and assume the mantle of the Rebbe in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. So they devised the following strategy. The grandfather had a large body of publications, a few of which had been brought to print, had been published, and many of which still remained in manuscript. And so they said, we are beginning a project of publishing your grandfather's kitvei yad, your grandfather's manuscripts. Will you help us in this? Well, first he said, well, this is wonderful. I'm so glad that you're doing this. Of course, I revere the memory of my grandfather, but I really have no knowledge of Hasidism. This is not my field. If you want me to give you brisker Torah, if you want me to give Lomdas, I'm happy to do that, but I really have no real exposure to Hasidism. So they said, but you're still the grandson. Help us with decoding the Ksav Yad. Sometimes there's a difficult word. Maybe you can help us doing that. They got him involved in decoding the manuscript and transferring it first to typescript and then eventually to print. And because of that, this young man began learning Hasidism, maybe for the first time in any serious, sustained way. He learned classic Hasidic texts. He learned the texts of his grandfather. When his grandfather quoted Zohar, he looked up the Zohar. Anyway, as we say in Yiddish, bislach, little by little, he got involved in the Hasidic world, and he began to understand in a deeper way the writings of his grandfather and the deeper significance of this whole Hasidic world. And he began to speak with elder Hasidim who knew his grandfather well. He began to learn the traditions. Finally, after a number of years of this, the Hasidim in Eretz Yisrael called him and said, we would like you to come and to be the Rav, the Rebbe in our Beis HaMedrash. And eventually they got him to move to Eretz Yisrael. But he didn't want to call himself the Rebbe. He said, I'm not calling myself the Rebbe. I'm not a Rebbe. That's not who I am. After a while, He got used to the idea of being the central focus of the community. He saw that it wasn't for him at all, that it was for the Hasidim. The Hasidim needed to have someone to look to for Torah, for wisdom, for guidance, for a derech avodah. He began to come into the role. Eventually, he acceded to the idea that he would literally and figuratively take the seat of his beloved and revered grandfather. But there was one final step. There was going to be a, so to speak, a coronation. And it was to be a great celebration. The young man was going to be crowned with the mantle of the successor to the noble grandfather. The night before this event, the Hasidim brought this young man, who I'm not going to name, to the older Gabbai, the Gabbai who was the Gabbai still of the grandfather. He was a very elderly man. He was an Moshe of Zakanim, but he still had his mind. He was well into his 90s, and he remembered the grandfather very, very well. And they said, we're going to bring you who are going to take your grandfather's seat, we want you to meet the old Gabbai of your grandfather, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, whose memory is a blessing. He prepared himself, he went to the mikveh, and he was ready for the big day. The morning of the big day, they bring this young man, this Lakewood, this Litvish Talmid Chacham, who has now immersed himself in the world of Hasidus because of the Hasidim, not out of his own spark of interest, at least at the beginning. And they bring him into the room where the Zokain, where the elderly Gabbai of the old Rebbe was. And they sit him down, and the Gabbai says, I just have one question to ask you. Just one question. The young man was ready. He was studying Kisvei Yad, he was studying Zohars, he was studying Baal Shem Tov, he was studying Kedushas Levi, he was studying Hasidism. And the Gabbai said, no. I just have one question to ask you. He looks in, the old man looks in the young man's eyes and says, Zantir the Rebbe? Are you the Rebbe? And the young man was astonished by the question. He was taken aback. He wasn't ready for this. And he said, no, I'm not the Rebbe. No, absolutely not. And the Gabbai said, are you the Rebbe? And the young man said, no, but with a little less vehemence than before. The old man said, are you the Rebbe? And the young man said, well, I am the grandson of my grandfather, who was the Rebbe. And the old man said the very same words, are you the Rebbe? And the young man said, I've immersed myself in the writings of my grandfather, and I've helped to bring them to publication. The old man said, are you the Rebbe? And the young man said, the Hasidim are about to seat me in the actual seat of my grandfather. And the old man said, are you the Rebbe? And the young man said, the Hasidim want to call me the Rebbe. And again, the Gabbai, the old Gabbai, asked just one question, are you the Rebbe? Until the young man finally said, with tears in his eyes, I am the Rebbe. Just at that moment, the Gabbai, the old Gabbai, jumped up, opened up the door for the Hasidim who were waiting outside with schnapps and kichel. And they said, come in, Machtel Chaim, Mehoben a Rebbe. We have a Rebbe now. This story, when I heard it, really did bring tears to my eyes, and it exemplified the story of the succession of Hasidism over these decades, especially over the unimaginable abyss of the Holocaust and everything else that happened in the 20th century. And it was largely the Hasidim who made the Rebbe as much as the Rebbe made the Hasidim. We're going to focus on two figures. There are really so many that we could and should focus on. Thinking of some that we're not going to have time for, like the Baba Rebbe, who just built an amazing community, coming with almost nothing after the war, and simply by the beauty and the force of his personality, the beauty of his soul, and the fact that he was truly a pastor to every member of the community. I heard it told that the Baba Rebbe never missed going to a bar mitzvah, a bris, a shalom zacher. On the other side, sadly, a levaya of each and every individual of his community. If somebody had a shalom zacher celebrating a new birth, the Baba Rebbe was there for decades and decades. And I do advise you to look at, you can see this on YouTube, the mitzvah dance of the Baba Rebbe dancing with his granddaughter. This is just so elegant, so beautiful, so moving, so heart-opening. The mitzvah dance, and the Baba Rebbe, old as he was, somehow was light-footed. He danced with grace. He danced with dignity. He danced with elegance. He danced with light-footedness with his granddaughter. It was absolutely stunning. You can find this on YouTube. So there are many Rebbeim that we should talk about that we cannot talk about, but I'm going to focus on two specifically. First, one who did not make it through the Shoah, who did not make it past the Shoah, but was killed in the middle of the war, and that's Rav Kleinemius Kalmish Shapiro of Piasetzna, the Piasetzna Rebbe. And then we're going to talk about one who did escape Europe and not only made it through the war, but absolutely flourished after the war, and that's the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So, Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote, who was himself a scion of the Apter Rav and all the great Hasidic Rebbeim of Europe, the seventh day is like a palace in time with a kingdom for all. It is not a date, but an atmosphere. Mutatis mutandis, one might say the very same of Lubavitch. Lubavitch is no longer so much a place, but certainly not a place so much in Europe, but an atmosphere. The atmosphere surrounding the Lubavitcher Rebbe, created largely by him. Lubavitch is wherever the Rebbe is or was, and wherever there is a hiskashrus, a bonding to the Rebbe. When uttering the word Lubavitch nowadays, almost no one thinks of a town in Russia. What comes to mind is rather an address in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, 770 Eastern Parkway, or simply 770. This location is linked to a far-flung network of Chabad houses throughout the world, established by the Rebbe and staffed by idealistic men and women who continue to be motivated by their bond to the Rebbe even after his death in 1994. But before we say more about the Lubavitcher Rebbe who did survive the war, I do want to begin with the Piasetzna Rebbe, Rav Kleinemius Kalmish Shapiro of Piasetzna. Some of you may be familiar with the Warsaw Ghetto writings, the book that was initially published under the title Eish Kodesh by his nephew in 1960 and has been edited, reprinted, republished in an amazing new version by the young scholar Daniel Reiser. I'm going to say more about that in a bit. Piaseczny Rebbe was born in 1889 in the town of Grodzisk, Poland. Remember, you heard about this yesterday, or if you saw session number 3, that's when we talked about Grodzisk. He was a descendant of Rebbe Elimelech of Zzensk, a seer of Lublin, the Maggid of Kozhenitz. His father was Rebbe Elimelech of Grodzisk. The period in which he grew up, in which he became Rebbe, was very, very challenging. We've already mentioned the overwhelming catastrophe of the Shoah. But it's important to recall that the period between World War I and World War II, and even before World War I, there was a time of revolutionary change for the Jewish family in Poland. There was a generation gap. There was a process that is called Polenization. That is to say, people wanted to join the Polish general community, and secularization. These were affecting the youth in particular, so that parents steeped in tradition were often viewed by their children as being hopelessly backward. In addition, there was a shift of population to the large cities that brought pressures to the Hasidic movement. They were crammed into the teeming streets and alleys and tenements of Warsaw, Lodz, and other large cities. Very, very different than the pristine, rather isolated shtetl in which the Hasidic movement had its birth. Warsaw was a large cosmopolitan city known as the Paris of Eastern Europe. It had theater, it had art, it had music, it had moving pictures, it had cafes, it had all kinds of less attractive aspects of city life. And so the young people were very attracted to political movements, to social movements, to cultural possibilities that they did not have. Many of the young people were losing the Hasidic fold, were leaving the Hasidic fold. In that milieu, the Piaseczny Rebbe began writing tracts of systematic Hasidic education. That is to say, how should Hasidic education proceed? His first book was called Chovat HaTalmidim, first published in 1932. He addresses it first to the teachers and parents and talks about the failure of the traditional educational institutions to stem the rising tide of defections from the observant community. And Reb Shapiro says, we need to change our way of teaching children. Authoritarian discipline and rote learning is not working, but we must engage the child as an active agent in their own personal growth. And he quotes the verse from Mishlei, Chanoch lenar al pi darko. Each child has a particular way of learning, and we must not impose a modality of learning on the child, but we must listen to the child to see how it is that they want to grow, in what way, what are they attracted to, what modalities will capture their heart and their mind. We must learn from the child more than we must teach the child. Talk of punishment should be avoided, for it is the surest way to alienate young children. Instead, the teacher should sprinkle his teachings with touches of humor and not neglect to invoke the power of the imagination in such forms as the parable and the story while imparting his message. He was psychologically astute. At one point, he tells the young people how to deal with anger. A very, very interesting bit of advice. He says, if one of the students feels an obsessive hatred towards a fellow, as often happens, maybe for no reason whatsoever, he says, write that person a letter. Don't send the letter. Heap scorn on that person as much as your venomous heart desires, and just write out all the things that you hate about the person, that you think you hate. Then read the letter aloud by yourself in the privacy of your room for several days, while imagining that you are facing him and reviling him with these words of abuse. After some days, no doubt your anger will leave your heart and you will hasten to reconcile with him. That is to say, this is a psychological modality of articulating the animosity that is percolating in a person's heart, getting it all out, and then realizing that the whole thing is based on nothing, is utterly ridiculous, and then the hatred will dissipate. So the Chovat HaTalmidim was the first educational work to come out. Then he had a work called Hachsharat HaAvrechim for more advanced students, and he says, Hislahavut, fervor, must be taught and developed by employing such means as song, music, and dance. The Rebbe played the violin himself. The goal is to uncover one's soul. That is to say, the idea is that your soul has yearnings that you may not be consciously aware of, and you must create a bridge from your inner soul to your outer consciousness to allow that to come forward, and then you will develop as a Hasid and as a true Oved Hashem, as a true servant of God. He talks about guided imagery that he calls machshava chazaka, a strong, intense thought, where you guide yourself in your imagination in a particular way. For example, he says, imagine you're Ola Regal, imagine you're going to the temple in Jerusalem, and eventually you're in Har HaBayit, you're in the Beit HaMikdash, you're bowing at the Beit HaMikdash, and eventually you can imagine yourself even as the high priest going into the Holy of Holies. This brings a vividness and intensiveness and a focus and a power to your spiritual work, and this percolates into every aspect of your sacred life. Then he has a meditation technique. I have to say that when I first spoke with Piasetzner Hasidim in the late 70s and 80s, I was really quite amazed to find this technique that he calls the hashkata. And he says, first of all, you silence your mind from the flow, from the rushing flow of everyday consciousness. We all know that our everyday mind is filled with all kinds of random thoughts that push us to and fro. Things that we have to do, things that we haven't done, thoughts that we're thinking about, activities that we might be engaged in, people that we need to speak to, calls that we need to make, and nowadays emails and so on. There's so many thoughts rushing through the mind. He says, first of all, the way to dampen those thoughts is to focus on something, or you can focus on the flow of your thoughts. Don't be invested in the thought, but look at the thought from the outside as a witness. This is a technique of witnessing one's thoughts from the outside. Eventually you will see that the flow of your conscious mind, of all those cognitive ideas that are coursing through, will dampen down and be quieted. Once you're in the quiet state, you can put in, as he says, machshava achat shel kedusha, one holy thought. I think of it as dropping a pearl in the placid surface of a gentle pond. You drop in a thought. I must tell you that I do practice this teaching, not always every day, but when I do, I think of a verse in Scripture, V'noam Hashem Elokeinu Oleinu. May the pleasantness of God be upon us. You drop that thought into your quiet mind. But that's not the end. Then he says, if you're working on some aspect of your avodah, of your service of God, of your sacred service, then you speak to God in the first person. Some of you may be familiar with a similar technique, Rabbi Nachman's Boidedus. This is similar but not exactly the same as Rabbi Nachman's. In any event, he says, speak to God and make a request for what it is that you want. For example, he says in the vernacular, his example is in Yiddish, but I can say it in English. I want to have deeper wisdom, deeper understanding of your Torah and of the world, O God. One can ask for deeper emunah. I want to have a greater sense of faith, meaning an awareness of your presence, an awareness that you, God, are always with us, holding our hand, smiling at us, looking at us, protecting us, moving us forward in a safe and proper way. Whatever it is that you're working on, you can ask that, but very, very quietly. So again, as not to reawaken the flow of conscious thinking and that rushing stream that may prevent deeper spiritual intensity. So the first part is quieting the mind. The second part is dropping that sacred pearl into now the placid surface. The third part is the bakasha, requesting a spiritual gift, an aspect of the spiritual life that you're working on. The final stage is, he says, end with a nigun. I saw the manuscript of this hashkata. It is now printed in one of the Rebbe's books called Derech HaMelech. You can find it online in Sefaria, but I saw the manuscript back in the 1980s. And he gives an example. He says the nigun that he suggests using is, I imagine you can use any nigun, but he says the nigun that we all know for the words in Psalms, Horeini Hashem darkecha, ahalech ba'amitecha, yached levavi lira shemecha. So I asked the rabbi who had the manuscript, who was a disciple of the Piasetzner Rebbe, and who had escaped Warsaw in late 1939, really after the Nazi invasion, but before the ghetto had been walled off, so it was still possible to escape. And as many other people did, he went by way of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. He wound up in Kobe, Japan. And then he eventually came to Eretz Yisrael. So I asked this rabbi who had the manuscript, and I said, well, what is this nigun for the words, Hareini Hashem darkecha? Show me, O God, your ways. Ahalech ba'amitecha. I want to walk in your truth. Yached levavi lira shemecha. Unite my heart to have awe and reverence for your name, O God. And this is what he's saying. It's a very, very simple melody. Hareini Hashem darkecho, ahalech ba'amitecho, Yachad levavi lira shemecho. It's actually more a chant than what we would call a melody, but the simplicity and the restfulness and the ease and the equipoise are really emblematic of what the Rebbe wanted to achieve in the hashkata, in this technique that he calls quieting the mind, as well as in his entire Hasidus. Because his Hasidus was a Hasidus not so much of activism, it certainly wasn't brassy, it certainly wasn't muscular. You know, when Hasidism moved from the shtetl into the large cities, some Hasidic groups became what I would call very muscular. That is to say, there was a sense of intensity that we have to show how strong we are, how courageous we are, how we don't care about the rest of the world, and how we're tough and how we are resilient. It became almost like a military contingent. The Hasidic communities varied in this regard. Some became insular, some became, as I said, militant and muscular. Some were focused on militant anti-Zionism. As you know, that was sort of a key feature of their Hasidic persona. The Piasetzner Rebbe was certainly not anti at all. His brother was called the Admor Chalutz. His brother made Aliyah. Many members of his family made Aliyah and were very much involved in building Eretz Yisrael in the Zionist movement. Piasetzner Rebbe, for various reasons, had to stay in Poland, but he had none of that brazen toughness that some of the Hasidic groups adopted as a defense measure against the challenges of the modern era and the 20th century. It was very, very delicate and quiet at all times. One of his favorite teachings was a play on a verse in the second paragraph of the Shema. You know that the second paragraph of the Shema from the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe warns the people against lapsing into idolatry, avodah zarah. And he says, Hishamru lachem pen yiftel levavchem v'sartem v'avadatem elim achirim v'shtachvistem lahem. It says, if you lapse into idolatry, God forbid, v'charaf, God will be angry, and it says, v'avadatem meheira. You will be quickly removed from the land. Chas v'shalom. The Piasetzner Rebbe, going back to a tradition of his ancestor, the Kozhenetz Magid, reads it in a Hasidic vein. You know, the Hasidic teachings are that you can always sort of lift up a phrase in a different way, not removing it from the pshat, but bringing it in a somewhat different perspective. And he says, Va'avadetem meheira, you should banish haste. Meheira in the sense of a noun, haste, va'avadetem, you should destroy haste. That is to say, haste in any dimension is going to lead the person astray, especially in matters of religion, especially in matters of avodat Hashem. If it's worth doing at all, then it's worth doing slowly, carefully, meditatively, thoughtfully, internally, bringing your most internal emotions and feelings carefully and delicately into external expression. And exemplified by one of the texts that I think you have on your screen, where he's talking about nigun. And he says, if you see it there, Anicha batzelet hasharon shoshanat amakim, when you gaze deeply at me, Bisha sha'ata ma'mik einecha bi, ani martevet, I exude moisture in the form of good deeds, like a lily or like a rose, and utter song. And he says the main purpose of creation of all beings was for them to utter song. The Jew, according to him, is supposed to teach the world how to sing, but all of creation, even the angels, yearn to hear this song of glory to God. It's not meant for others. It means the person themselves. And ultimately, all the mitzvos must be performed tunefully. That is to say, it's not only when you're singing a nigum that you invest yourself in musicality, but as you go through your day, you can do it dryly, you can do it flatly, or you can go through your day tunefully, melodiously, sweetly, as a kind of a dance. And every aspect of your existence is, as he says, exuding the moisture of good deeds. In one of his works, he tells you how to work with a nigun for spiritual growth. He says, select for yourself a motif of a nigun. Turn your face to the wall, or just close your eyes, and reflect again that you stand before the throne of glory, meaning that you stand before God. You have come with shattered heart to pour out your soul to God in song, the melody that emerges now from the deep recesses of your heart. And you wonder about these tones. The nigun is embroidered. The nigun carries your soul in its innards to pour it out, to bring you close as an offering to God. The nigun is carrying you. these passages are examples of the Piasetzner Rebbe working with, I would call it, a psycho-spiritual sensitivity to bring out the inner spirituality of the Hasid and ultimately all of us, bringing out the spiritual possibilities of all of us. His works are extraordinary guidebooks of the spiritual life. Now, some people are familiar with his final writings. He was swept up in the Shoah. Of course, it wasn't called the Shoah at that time. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He continued writing and teaching. Miraculously, the work survived. It was buried. You see the milk cans here, the famous milk cans from the Ringelblum archives. And the Rebbe did not survive the war, but his writings really miraculously did. They were published first by his nephew in Tel Aviv in 1960, and then due to the work of an extraordinary young scholar, Daniel Reiser, in an amazing edition that has photocopies of the original manuscript. You can see the original manuscript as well as Daniel Reiser's transcription. You can see the crossing out. Of course, there was no word processors, and he's in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's probably half starving. He's freezing in the middle of the wintertime. He's still writing his final work based on his drushes to his Hasidim in the ghetto, giving hope, giving spirit, giving some sense of sacred possibility. And until the final moments, really in the summer of 1942, maybe even later, I would say the end of 1942, he's revising, he is crossing, he's adding footnotes and marginal notes to the side that are done very, very carefully. So he knew that he probably would not survive the war, but he's deeply invested in teaching, in giving something to the coming generations, and that promise was amazingly fulfilled. The manuscripts were discovered after the war. They have been published, and the Piasetzner writings now have enjoyed a tremendous rebirth of interest and excitement in the Hasidic world, in what is called the neo-Hasidic world, in the world of academia. There was a flourishing domain of what I would call Piasetzner studies. This entire phenomenon is a miracle. There's much more to say about the Piasetzner Rebbe, about his legacy, about his Warsaw Ghetto writings. I urge you to look at some of the literature. If you have the interest to do so, I highly recommend, this is a 2-volume set, I highly recommend purchase of the Daniel Reiser edition. It's an extraordinary monument to the Piasetzner Rebbe and to the amazing work of a young scholar. In the time that we have left, I want to transition to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who did survive, who came over to the United States with his father-in-law, and who built, as I think we all know, this extraordinary movement. So one of the things that I want to say was the Lubavitcher Rebbe influenced a number of the major leaders of the modern period. I've been reading memoirs of leaders, not necessarily Hasidic leaders, and it's remarkable how many of them mention the Lubavitcher Rebbe. For example, the former Israeli Chief Rabbi Meir Lau devotes a lengthy section of his memoir to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he describes the meeting that he had with the Rebbe as one of the highlights of his life. He went with his father-in-law, whose name was Rabbi Yitzchak Yedidia Frankel, and he said the Rebbe gave a class that lasted 4 hours without using notes or opening a book, not even once. In his class, he referred to both classic and esoteric sources, earlier and later authorities from all periods. He cited entire sections by heart. Rabbi Lau says his father-in-law was difficult to impress, and his father-in-law had met all of the Gedolim of Europe, certainly of Poland, and he said, "I witnessed the magnificence of Polish Jewry. I have known most of the great scholars of recent generations. I have never seen such a command of the material. That is genius." And Rabbi Lau credits the Lubavitcher Rebbe with preparing him to become chief rabbi, predicting Lau's election as chief rabbi of Israel and encouraging him to prepare for his role. But he's not the only chief rabbi who was encouraged by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I'm thinking of the late chief rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, whose loss is felt by many of us, including our family. Members of my family will be very clear telling you that Rabbi Sachs's writings got them through COVID. And Rabbi Sachs, even though he passed away not long ago, his writings, as you know, are continuing to be published, and he is a source of inspiration and guidance for Jews and for non-Jews throughout the world. Rabbi Sachs credits his move to thinking about Jewish leadership to two great leaders that he met in a very early trip to the United States when he was still a student. One was Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, and one was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He said that the Lubavitcher Rebbe really inspired him to think about the significance of the need for Jewish leadership. Sachs was going to become an academic philosopher. He was one, but he could have been perhaps one of the major philosophers of the 20th century. But he was inspired by the Rebbe to think about rabbinic leadership, and of course, that's exactly that is the path that he took. I'm going to quote a contemporary scholar, a friend of mine, Shaul Stamfer, who talks about the possession of Talmudic charisma of knowledge is enhanced by wide exposure to challenging classical texts. And the Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, had that charisma. That is to say, before anything else, many of you may be familiar with Chabad houses and so many things that the Rebbe accomplished and all of his initiatives. What I want to stress here is that he was one of the great rabbinic scholars of his day. He was, as another Talmudist said, he was Baki Bechol Chadrei HaTorah. There was not any aspect of the Jewish sacred library that he did not have total command of. He was in command of absolutely everything. Yes. So the Rebbe gave sichos. He would speak on Shabbos, he would speak on Yontif, and of course the Hasidim could not write on Shabbos or Yontif, but there were chosrim. There were specially trained and dedicated disciples who would meet immediately after Shabbos. They would come together and they would write the Rebbe's words close to verbatim. Then the Rebbe would review what they had written. There would be a number of rounds of editing, and eventually the sichos would be published. There were, I believe, 39 plus volumes of sichos. It's an enormous library. Then there are letters from the Rebbe. The Rebbe's publications themselves could fill an entire library. In addition to the sichos, which were relatively popular, there were also ma'amorim. The ma'amorim were more esoteric. A ma'amar develops a specific topic in Chabad theory, usually more abstract and complex than the relatively accessible sicha, with dialectic turns and seeming reversals. The ma'amar would be delivered in a characteristic repetitive chant whose cadence imparted a gravitas to the words, impelling the flow of ideas with an intense momentum. the mamar was introduced with a contemplative wordless melody or nigun that was a signal for all present, even those who had been seated, to stand. The rabbi, this is a Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he was saying a mamar, appeared to be in an altered state. So you had two kinds of discourses. There was the Sikha, which was still laden with Kabbalah, with Hasidism, with quotes from the Zohar, with Midrash, Talmud, Halacha, especially Rashi and the Rambam. These were his favorite sources. He was a great expositor of Rashi, Maimonides, but every aspect of Jewish literature, but perhaps more focused on action, a little more accessible, and then the more esoteric, really mystical mamar, where the Lubavitcher Rebbe would enter into a transformed state, sort of leave his body, really hispashtus hagashmius, hispashtus hachumrius. I want to mention the Rebbe as transmitter of stories. I have a series which the Lubavitcher Hasidim put together, excerptions of tapes, excerptions of recordings of the Rebbe. He would speak often during the weekdays on special events, Rosh Chodesh, Yutes Kislev, other special days in the Chabad calendar, and those, of course, could be recorded. And so there are excerptions of his telling stories from the Chabad tradition from Eastern Europe. He was also a conductor. Is to say, the Rebbe taught Chabad traditional melodies, many of which had been forgotten or had maybe suffered neglect because of the Shoah. And these melodies would basically transmit the values that he wanted the Hasidim to embrace and to live by. So I'm thinking of, for example, Ufaratzta yama v'kedma tzafona v'negba. Ufaratzta yama v'kedma. Ufaratzta tzafona v'negba. I'm not going to do the whole thing. It's from the blessing to Yaakov that you should spread out east, west, north, and south, which of course Chabad has done in an extraordinary way. A phrase from the famous letter of the Baal Shem Tov, I may have mentioned it in the first lecture, where the Baal Shem Tov goes up to heaven, sees the Mashiach, sees the Messiah, and says, "When are you going to come?" And the Mashiach answers the Baal Shem Tov, "When your well springs will spread out as far and wide as possible." And Chabad understands this to mean the Chabad understanding of the Baal Shem Tov teaching, and they have certainly implemented that in the most vigorous and vibrant and really beautiful and deeply impactful way. They have spread out to every corner of the globe, as we all know. And then I'm thinking of the Rebbe singing, Sama lecha nafshi, kama lecha bisari, me'eretz siya ve'ayev b'lei mayim. There's more to it. You can find it online. It's about the yearning of the soul for God in a dry and a parched land. And we can eventually come to see God. Kain ba'kodesh chazisicha liros uscha uchavodecha. So each of these nigunim is marshaled by the Rebbe as an anthem to inspire and to encourage and to spark his Hasidim to the mission of spreading the Hasidic teachings in the Lubavitch version throughout the entire world, which again, as we know, they have done in the most extraordinary way. The Lubavitcher Rebbe affected the transformation of Chabad from an inner directed movement to an outer facing movement, from a lineage that prized lengthy contemplative prayer to one that celebrates bold feats of outreach. The biography of the Rebbe should mention, and I want to mention, his command of the entire textual corpus of Rabbinic Judaism, his mastery and creative deployment of the paradoxical, intricate, and labyrinthine Chabad theological system, administrative proficiency that apparently included near total recall of names and faces and relevant facts, manifest spiritual intensity and boundless energy, displayed in the orchestration of collective rites of numinous transmission. Well, that's my way of saying a Farbrengen. The ability to listen deeply, counsel wisely, bring out the best in interlocutors, outsiders as well as devotees, and passionate concern for the destiny of the Jewish people as he understood it. That is to say, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was one of the most extraordinary leaders that the Jewish people have ever had, and I would say one of the most extraordinary leaders in any domain in the 20th century and perhaps of all time. I want to conclude with a teaching of the Rebbe from one of the Sichos. And this has been very, very beautifully written up and presented in an English article by Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mays. He's my son-in-law, I'm very proud to say. I'm going to read some of what he says here. This is from a Sicha Parshas Kisisa. It's about the golden calf. We know the golden calf was the greatest sin, right? That's to say, right after, 40 days after Mount Sinai, have no other gods before me, they make a golden calf. And yet the Lubavitcher Rebbe finds a way to say, well, even the Erev Rav, even the mixed multitude, did teshuvah. And by doing teshuvah, not only do they save the people, they save themselves. The Erev Rav, according to this understanding, did survive the aftermath of the golden calf. And in his reading, they are higher than the tzaddikim, because the Gemara says about teshuvah, a repentant person goes to a higher place than the tzaddik. So the Rebbe's reading of the golden calf episode is that the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, which generally gets, shall we say, not a favorable press in Jewish sources, they are the greatest heroes of the story. And I want to conclude with one final flip, which I find extraordinary. The Rebbe relates this to the episode of Eliyahu Bahara Carmel. You recall in the book of Kings, in the Sefer Melachim, the people are worshiping Baal, the Canaanite idol. Eliyahu, Elijah, makes this great test with the prophets of the Baal. There are two bulls. And one bull is given to the prophets of the Baal, and nothing happens, and they are defeated. And Elijah pours water on his altar, but fire comes down from heaven and consumes all the water, and the sacrifice is brought up to heaven, and the people say, Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem hu Elokim. The Lord is God, the Lord is God. So it's a great victory. The Midrash says that the bull that was chosen for the Canaanite idolaters resented the fact that he had to be offered for idolatry. He said, my other bull, it was a sister bull, it was a brother bull, it was from the same mother, is being offered to God, and why am I being offered to idolatry? And the answer that was given is no, kishem, just like the name of heaven is being sanctified by the one going to heaven, so too you think it's for idolatry, but in the greater spirit you are being offered to heaven. And the Rebbe concludes, this is the way we have to look at the world. Nothing is irredeemably evil, nothing is irredeemably lost, everything is possible to lift up. You Hasidim, he says to the Hasidim, have the mandate of going out into the secular world, what you think is secular, and finding the sources of light everywhere, and saying, you can be redeemed, you can be uplifted, you can transform the world, you can bring the Mashiach. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you.